Okay. So we will start with the discussion now. I'm glad to introduce the moderator, because moderators rarely introduce themselves, they introduce other people. So we're happy that Bente Scheller is here. She's the head of the division of the Middle East division in the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. And also I use this opportunity to be here again on stage to tell you that after the discussion, you're all invited to drink and eat with us under the how-to, which is the other stage of how, at the vow. We will all go together after the event. So, Bente, thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Thank you also from before, Monica and Mario. It is great to be here tonight, and it's amazing to see how many people came in the end. Well, it's difficult after this powerful concert. I'm really very moved, and it is the first time that I see it. Monica, of course, told me about it, but I find it really very impressive and strong. So what an opening for this evening. But we'll continue strong because I have amazing guests with me tonight. I'll first introduce them, then we'll have some introductions for their respective focus of the evening and some discussion. And I also ask you, please think about questions or comments you might want to pose. You can later on do so. We'll have microphones in the room. And please also keep in mind, only when you're using the microphone, the interpreters will be able to hear you. So we'll come to that later, but maybe already think about what you might want to say or comment or ask yourselves. Probably I would not need to introduce Yassin Al-Haj Saleh. He's a leading thinker, writer, intellectual, and a former political prisoner of Syria. It's 16 years and 14 days he spent in prison altogether in different Syrian prisons, and among them the infamous Tadmor prison. You were released in 1996, and what got you into prison in the first place under Hafiz al-Assad was to be a member of the Communist Party's political bureau. When then, in 2011, the revolution started, I think you were one of the most present figures from the intellectuals of Syria to be very visible, to be there for the people, and to be a respected advisor. And for documentation and political thought, I think you made yourself another name. And since 2013, Yassin is in exile. It was the year also when his wife, Samira, unfortunately, was kidnapped. A sad chapter, and I find it amazing that you, Yassin, find the strength. You still advise us, you still give intellectual input, and amongst others, you should read Yassin's book, The Impossible Revolution, Making Sense of the Syrian Tragedy. Welcome here, Yassin. Not much less prominent amongst those who care for Syria anyway is Joumana Seif. Joumana is a lawyer and a feminist, an activist and a leading figure in human rights. And that not only for Syria, but of course with a focus on Syria. One of the very strong points that Joumana has been highlighting and bringing to the debate is sexual and gender-based violence. And she has been doing so particularly as a legal advisor of the International Crimes and Accountability Programs of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, ECCHR. In this capacity, she moved ahead the Khatib trial in Koblenz, but that is just among the many of her achievements. She has been leading an active role in policy coordination for the missing and disappeared. She has been tending to survivors of torture and their families, and she was awarded the Anne Klein Prize for this engagement. So very much welcome, Joumana. And last but not least, we have with us Lynn Maalouf. Before it was mentioned that Amnesty qualified the Setnaya prison as a human slaughterhouse, so Lynn looks back at a long history as an advocate for law, like in the intersection of human rights and international law. As Amnesty, head of the Middle East program before, but now she's an advisor, the senior human rights advisor to the Office of the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen. I think her record in working on accountability in the Middle East is very long for Lebanon, for Syria, and for the subject as such. So I'm very glad that you're here today with us as well. And yeah, when I just was seeing and listening to the lyrics also, there was one sentence that particularly caught my eye. That was the one on, "Let the delusion of fear not nibble away on us." Yassin, one of the first moments when I really saw you out and doing something political was in 2003 when I was on the street. There were the protests against the Iraq war. And knowing about your long time in prison before, I said something like, after all these years in prison, how amazing is it that you're still out and protesting and it could bring you to prison again? And you looked at me, and of course it was a stupid comment, but you then told me, of course I am. If I would not be politically active now, all the years in prison would have been in vain, and they won't break me. And this spirit I find very strong. I think also, like, talking about Syrian prisons and about atrocities that people suffer, you could lose your faith in humanity, and then you meet people like Yassin, like the musicians, and you think, well, this is also the strongest point to believe in humanity. So, Yassin, here, I would like to invite you. Give us an input. You can look back at the times of prison under Hafez al-Assad, but of course you have been relentlessly also working on prison affairs afterwards. Please share with us what you would like to say about Syrian prison back then, today, and what might be similarities, for whom there might be similarities, and what we should know about that.
Thank you, Bente. Masal khair.
Good evening.
So, first of all, I liked my answer. Actually, I forgot the whole thing. It is 21 years ago, but I can recognize.
I'm going to speak Arabic. For me, it's better to speak Arabic. I know that you were emotionally touched by my answer, and after so many years in prison, and having not deserved prison, so otherwise this would just be in vain, all these years. So we have to express it in a different way. And since I spent this time in prison, people were religious, quasi-religious conviction that I would have to commit a crime which I had been convicted of before without having convicted it. I did not imagine that they were not going to leave me alone, obviously. So let's get back to the main subject now, what we want to talk about. In Syria, we have among the former political detainees a common saying, that meaning that we went out from the little prison into the big prison when we were released. So that's saying that someone who's, that when you get out of the little prison, then you feel humiliated. That when you get out into the bigger prison, it's again a different form of prison and imprisonment. So once I went out, and then that was confirmed also by an Egyptian former detainee who had been detained for 10 years in Al-Sisi's prisons again now. So their creative approaches, also what we've seen now being perverted, and also intellectual approaches. That it's a very painful experience. And it's not something that's being lost. What we're trying to get from having been in prison, we try to gather the best from a very bad experience, and so to diminish the loss as far as possible. But in this expression, there's something important to my mind, and that is that prison or imprisonment is the most important political institution, and it's the most important instrument of those in power, of the regime. All kinds of what happens inside prison, torture, and there's also kind of continuation from what we lived in our generation in incarceration and those who were incarcerated after the revolution in Syria for the past 14 years up until this very day. And also the forced disappearance and the experience of going into exile and different kinds of mistreatment. So in Syria there used to be two bodies implementing from the very start. And a political body that was the Progressive Popular Front, and then there was the prison on the other side. And then there were also like a big cage created for those who opposed the regime. And the political body is basically almost no longer there, and it has been destroyed, so to speak. It's something that has no longer any meaning. And on the other hand, the prison grow more important, and the institutionalized persecution. These are very powerful and fearful political institutions, and they torture whom they want, and they almost kill whomever they want, arbitrarily. Syria is a torture state from the very beginning of Assad's reign. It has not always been as a brutal torture. It was always being permitted. And there's one example that's very well known for an officer who was punished for having committed torture or having killed a prisoner. There is a law in Syria that was in the end of the 60s that was promulgated, and there was the state security quarters set up, which guarantees the immunity of the members of the security forces. They're being called crimes, but anyway, they receive immunity. So the idea is that prison in Syria is not a sideline body which might detain and arrest certain people, a limited number of people. No, it's one of the basic pillars of the regime. And then that gives a certain legitimacy to the existence of prison. In my generation, when I was young, the number of political prisoners were about several thousands. And in the Palmyra prison, there were more than 1,700 people, 17,000 people who disappeared and were just eliminated. They were either killed or tortured to death. And 2 times a week people were executed, and then sometimes it was 200 people were executed one time in one go. And I gave an interview to Der Spiegel as well, and I spoke about all this. And those who died in prison, from my experience, I can say, is based on what I know, 15,000 maybe. I don't know where they were buried, that's not known, and where their bodies were being thrown away. Palmyra prison in the 80s, most of the 80s and the 90s, was not really a prison. It was a place of forced disappearance, because the families and the relatives did not know anything about what happened to their loved ones and their relatives. Fortunately, I only spent 1 year in that famous prison in Palmyra, and then was when my family never learned about where I was. So there's a continuation in imprisonment and forced disappearance in this period from the end of the 70s until the beginning of the new millennium. So in this period, there were all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds, ideological, political backgrounds. But usually people do not have an idea about the political situation in Syria. And when we speak about it, most people underwent the police expedient and security expedient. They were called to appear in the intelligence branches, and they were placed in waiting for hours on end, and sometimes we'd have to go back the next day, and that was to have them wear off their nerves. And that could happen to almost everyone. When then basic this ideas of that is 15,000 or 20,000 people, it has been thought today that there are 130,000 people who have been forcefully disappeared, and that is not fixed numbers. So the idea that we have here, to give you an idea of how many people passed through that experience, that security services experience. And so how in the current situation, so we have 7 million people who are refugees outside their country. So people are spread over 117 states now over the past decade, over the past 13 years in 117 or 127 countries. In almost all the countries of the world, there are Syrians now. And then there is that cannot be understood without understanding this background, this backdrop to it. It is a political annihilation. People are not being killed for exclusive political reason, but they're killed politically. We were being destroyed because most people were arrested. Most party members were arrested. And the political party is being destroyed when all its members are being detained, or half of its members have disappeared, or more than half of it. Almost all the members of a political party have been detained, from my particular party, for instance. So they're being annihilated politically. They're being completely destroyed. And there's something that's, if we have a political destruction and annihilation in the 70s and 80s, there's a discussion ongoing and a discourse about using the word of genocide. I would like to finish, because I don't want to take too much time from the ladies here. The musical nice pieces that were being played. We also have a prison literature which is quite strong, and how Syrians have passed through this experience. When we speak about prison, it's talking about freedom. All this prison literature, all this remembering and reminiscing about the time in prison, and to bringing to light and highlighting the experience in Circus. It's an expression of our longing for freedom and the idea of freedom in our life and our personal biographies. And when I think about my work, I tend to think about, I might consider myself, I've been turned into a writer. When I think about my work, I would say, when I speak about the political annihilation and about prison, and it's basically about the idea of freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yassin. We'll get back to that later. Since you said you don't want to take too much time from the ladies, I think for now I'll give Joumana the chance. I think also, Joumana, you'll be able to connect, because when we met, your father was in prison. That was the 2000, 2001, 2002 period, when the transition of presidency to Bashar al-Assad had erased hopes that were never fulfilled, at least hopes from the outside, and prison was not interrupted, but it continued, and fear and political violence through prison experience spread. But I mean, you also have been working so much in terms of the trials with survivors of torture, with members of families who have disappeared and missing among them. So maybe you add a bit on what Yassin just started, and maybe you could also shed some light on the gender aspects. How is the violence experienced in prison and the prison experience as such, as well as the aftermath, different between men and women?
Thank you very much, Bente. Yassin has spoken up very openly about these, remembering these days we all remember, such as Yassin and the other young men, when they were still young, they were very courageous then. They were opposing the totalitarian regime. There also used to be women who refused to give in to this authoritarian regime. Some of those are still continuing their struggle. Some are no longer with us, some are still with us, and they have paid a heavy price for their struggle. And they spent years and years on end in prison. With all these experiences we've been listening to, it was not very easy to add this upon the experience of men. There was the societal violence, I would like to call it, and all this scandalizing of women after they'd gotten out of all this dire experience. Another observation about Syrian prisons, since from the very start, from when Hafiz al-Assad took over the power in 1969, 1970, up until this very day, up until after the revolution in 2011, women were used as hostages, as pledges, and they were used to take revenge, as an instrument of revenge on the society. And many, many women, they're obviously political women, and they were courageous, and they paid a price for their commitment. But there are also huge numbers of women who have, since that very time, since the 70s, been held as hostages. There were like 14-year-old girls from a school, or 15, 16 years, who were arrested in their very schools, and they spent 9 years in prison. There are women who stayed with all these dire conditions of torture, 7 years, 8 years, as pledges and hostages to use against their husbands with their children. Another remark which I would like to add, it's about the art, the kind of violence, the physical violence, also the psychological violence, and the sexual violence, and the gender-based sexual violence, sexualized violence, which would have come out in the Koblenz Straits, also in the international reports that have been published recently, which was used in a widespread and in what was all particularly used after the Syrian revolution. We have more than 15 testimonies from women and men who used to be in prison inmates, and we gathered them. Also those who had been imprisoned after the revolution. And when we compared these two experiences from before and after the revolution to each other, we noticed that it was still the same torture and same methods being used against them, and then also sexualized violence, also for the political opponents. It was also something relating to silencing them and to dehumanize and insult them and dehumanize them. When we try to compare the situation today in Syria, when we are talking about the situation, the situation is still as it used to be. All kinds of international crimes under international law have been committed in Syria. They have all been committed in Syria. There's no exception. Torture, extrajudicial killings, sexualized violence, forced disappearances. And when we're speaking here today, we're not only speaking about crimes that have been committed since the 70s or the 80s or since 2011. All these crimes are still being committed in Syria at this very moment and up until this very day in the prison and detention centers center in Syria. The best example is maybe about the continuation of the situation, the trial or the lawsuit that has been brought forward by the Netherlands and Canada at the International Court of Justice. And this lawsuit is about Syrian violations by the Syrian Republic against those signatory states of the International Convention on Torture. And they brought claims that a lawsuit that these obligations under this convention have been violated by Syria. And based on this submission by these states, in last November, the International Court of Justice issued provisional measure orders which mentioned that the Syrian regime had to stop and forbid and prevent all kinds of torture in all public authority bodies of Syria, and undertake the necessary steps to prevent any bodies and any militias from committing such crimes, and that they should also preserve all kinds of evidence and all kinds of documentation that relate to this, that they should be preserved and not destroyed. And now, a year after this decree issued by the court, all the reports that survey, and among them, for example, the report recently issued by the International Network for Human Rights, that there has been torture that was done to more than 1,161 people since last November. 43 people have been killed since last November, among them also children and women. And these are information also contained in other reports, also by the International Commission of Inquiry, Independent International Commission of Inquiry, which states that the violations that had been observed by the reports, that they do not diverge, and that no steps have been undertaken to protect anyone from torture. These measures and these practices are still ongoing, and that the conditions and the situation, the security situation has not evolved, and which also in the report that we issued in our networks was about abducting cases and when people died under torture, which was being mentioned. And those who are influential in power in the authorities in the regime have blackmailed the family members of those who had been abducted and incarcerated, and they were devolved of tens of thousands of dollars based on that blackmailing, and that is still ongoing as well until this very day. When we want to talk about the efforts to obtain justice for these crimes and these violations, in addition to the International Court of Justice, we try to use the ways of justice. Maybe you've heard about it for sure. The trials, which the only thing that has been open since the Russian and the Chinese media have obstructed the workings of the International Criminal Court. So the only way to give the competence and the power for third-party states such as Germany, which have signed a signatory state to the Rome's basic status, and to conduct investigations and trials into crimes committed in other states. Since 2017 and up until now, for many years, we have worked on submitting and working on this cooperation between the ECCHR, the European Center on Constitutional and Human Rights, in close cooperation with Syrian organizations and with states such as Germany, Sweden, Austria, and Norway, and also in France. There's a lot of efforts going on. To put it succinctly, these judicial efforts have been undertaken in Germany. In 2018, they culminated in the issuance of the first arrest warrant against Hassan, Jamil Hassan, excuse me, who was the former head of the air intelligence branch. Bente mentioned it. He was in charge and he was responsible for torture crimes against other crimes against humanity. And now in Germany we have numerous trials ongoing in Hamburg, in Stuttgart, and also in Frankfurt, from trials and cases brought against people who are being counted or they belong directly to the regime, and also from those who are affiliated with one of the militias, the National Army, also Hezbollah, and also things that were committed in Daraa by Hezbollah militias in France. There was a trial being conducted in absentia against Ali Mamlouk and Jamil Hassan, Abdel Salam Mahmoud, high people in powerful positions. After 4 days of bringing forward evidence, they were sentenced to lifelong imprisonment in absentia against the three. In France, there was an arrest warrant issuance against Bashar al-Assad and also 2 high-level officers for having used chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction in Syria. Dozens of times, based on the statistics, 214 times it was used by the regime against civilian population, and so far none of those in responsibility has been put to trial. And now I'm going to conclude by saying that the results of all these efforts, and which are still ongoing for trials, and the issuance of arrest warrants against Bashar al-Assad and high people in responsible position, are still ongoing. All these trials, which are currently being conducted, are being opened after lengthy investigations and evidence which make it likely that they've been committed. And since the trial is still ongoing, while it is still ongoing, so the judgment, how shall I? There's no succinct, even before there being a succinct judgment, the indictment sheets and the arrest warrants are not being issued unless there is substantial base of convincing evidence, a body of evidence that is sufficient. And all these crimes are still ongoing, are still being committed. And there's a narrative which states that Syria is safe now, and that states have started thinking about starting to reopen cooperation with the regime. So these are states, maybe we would think that these are undemocratic states which have gone into this kind of political discourse, but has been very prominent lately, that has moved also to Europe and has arrived here in Germany. And for me, as someone working seriously in the efforts to bring these to justice, and I know all these facts, I'm really astonished. I mean, I don't understand. As if there is a kind of schizophrenia between what the judicial bodies in Europe have proven, have established in France, in Germany, in Sweden, and between the level of political discourse and narrative that is being promulgated by politicians. And I'm going to stop with that and leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Indeed, thank you, Joumana. I very much share this sense, and I'm afraid that with the trials, where we always hope that when it comes to light, that it is structural, organized, systematic torture and violence, it will be also clear that you can't normalize. I can't really understand that, but I think for some people it might seem as if the files are closed, so it can't be stressed often enough. It's all ongoing, and ongoing also on a scale that we can't even imagine. Therefore, I would like to ask you, Lynn, for international support, UN mechanisms, commissions, institutions, because here I think that we also have an unprecedented level of international engagement in finding ways to approach accountability and justice. So maybe you give us some insights on how these work.
Yeah, you just talk. Oh, I just talk. Okay. I just want to segue into what Joumana just was saying, this divorce between the political and the judiciary, actually, and the legal. What the legal is telling us and the story that the legal is telling us, and the complete and the widening disparity with the political today that we are seeing exactly on this same issue. When I received a call 2 days ago from a Syrian journalist saying we have 50 cases in Belgium whose asylum applications have been refused. Among these 50, people are people who did time in prison or are relatives. And let us bear this in mind. If you are a relative of someone who was in prison in Syria, it means you are at risk of being detained. So these are people who are at risk of being detained, and they are being turned down. And this is something that we are seeing more and more of. I am here to speak of what the UN has done over the past 10 years, let's say. And I don't think there's any other place where this disconnect is so flagrant between the political and the human rights community. Where the political has failed the Syrians and Syria, it is the human rights community that did respond to the call. And as you were saying, Bente, I don't think we've seen this level of creativity, of pioneering, of really thinking of what ways can we go for when everything is blocked. But this is because it's individuals, Syrian individuals, who were pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing for this. So everything that you were talking about, Joumana, all of the movement for the justice, I don't think we've seen this level or this proliferation of cases on any other context before in the world. And this is all the Syrians in exile or inside the country who have been pushing for this. And it is thanks to them that this is happening today. It is thanks to them who have been pushing, and Canada and the Netherlands and the UN, to be able to achieve the results today. But one of the risks of this is that this is all happening in a very disconnected and fragmented way, the same way that the country is today. It is fragmented. But despite the fragmentation, and this is where I go back to what you were saying, it is not a side. The story of prison in Syria, it is not a side story, it is not a postscriptum, it is at the heart of the whole history of this region, but especially in Syria. We're talking about 50 years now. The new president, the young president, has almost done as many years as his father. We are at, I think, 50 years now of an authoritarian regime that has lost large swaths of its territory and is losing some more as we speak today here. Now, the conflict is still all over the place across all of the front lines. Of course, it's only convenient to those countries that are saying it is safe to go back. There is nothing safe about going back right now to Syria, and any close observer would know that. But to go back to the issue of the missing and detainees, it is the story of almost every household in Syria. When I was young, when I was growing up, we used to hear it all the time. The word of Hafiz al-Assad was whispered. It was never said out loud. In a few years ago, actually, in 2018-19, we organized with Amnesty International, when I was there with them at the time, we organized an exhibition also about the experiences of women detainees in Syria. And at that time, Fadwa Mahmoud, who I'm sure most of you know here, she stood up and she said, "مش رح نقعد عاقلين. أنا مش رح أقعد عاقلي." And this is the spirit of all of the families, either people who were detained themselves or mothers or daughters or fathers or brothers or sisters who have been suffering day by day the torture of either being in the prison or outside the prison and being aware of what goes on in these prisons and still not knowing what's happening to the people that they love. And the spirit that Fadwa that day was saying, "Ana مش رح أقعد عاقلي," I will not be a good kid. This is the change between the generations of the 80s and the 90s. And today, the very tragic reality that there is almost half of the population that is in exile, whether internally or abroad, but they are also able to build on that experience and to group, and they were able to group. And this is the story that led to how the UN did actually engage. And now I come to the UN. Sorry, and I don't want to take too much time, but yes, in 2021, there were 5 organizations representing families, survivors of detention, who grouped together as a coalition and started advocating actively for something to be done. The UN, in the very early days of the Commission of Inquiry, I think it was in 2012, they had already put out a report, documenting without any doubt the widespread and systematic practice of enforced disappearances and torture in custody and death in custody. And they recommended at the time that there should be one institution that was exclusively dedicated to this because of the very scale of how vast and extended the issue was. And just the scale of the numbers. And as we just heard, we don't even know the numbers. We only know the numbers of the cases that were documented. And as people who work in documentation, we know there's a vast, it's tricky to talk about numbers, but it does give us a sense of how widespread it is, how huge the scale is. And so they got together, these groups of families, the Truth and Justice Charter. They brought an expert, a South African jurist, Jeremy Sarkin, commissioned him to think what could be done when there is this scale, when the UN is blocking at the highest levels of the Security Council, there is a systematic veto for every single thing that can be done in terms of justice for Syrians. What can we do? And this was when they developed this study that was pushing for a standalone institution that would be exclusively dedicated to the search for individual cases. Now, we all know that there is the International Red Cross, other organizations, international and local organizations that do documentation, but resolving individual cases of where is that person detained? Is he still alive or not? Is she still alive or not? Where are they? How can we get these answers in a country that is effectively a black box to any person doing documentation? There are no journalists on the ground. There are no independent human rights organizations. Right now, we're celebrating the fact that UNHCR is able to be present at the border, and this is a celebration. because they are being granted access because of this very particular crisis. So the whole story of this institution that, yes, the Security Council was blocking everything, and then it goes to the General Assembly, and this is where the decision is taken. So the Truth and Justice Charter, composed of Syrian former detainees, survivors of torture, families of disappeared and missing persons from all over Syria. And here I would also like to say that, yes, we're talking about decades of an authoritarian regime. The tragedy today is that these same practices are being practiced all over the country by all of the authorities who are in charge of civilians under their control. And this is the tragedy, is that instead of seeing it curbed, it's just spreading. It's like gangrene all over the country. And this is why it is so important, the fight in pushing back with the storytelling and reclaiming narratives. And this is what the Syrians have been doing. It's reclaiming the narrative of the reality on the ground of what's happening. And this is something I am not sure whether the institute, the Independent Institute for Missing Persons, which was created by the General Assembly in June of 2023, it has the mandate to do search, to search for individual cases, but it also has the mandate to be supporting families and survivors. And it is the first institution that dictates that in its structure, the victims and families and survivors have to be involved, not just involved, participating in the design and the decision-making, in the strategy development. This is very new, and this was imposed by the Syrians themselves. It is wonderful. I mean, I don't know how we talk about something wonderful. It's not wonderful, but it's just very inspiring to see the trajectory. To see today, as we are sitting here, our region is up in flames wherever we're looking. And all of the suffering is still going on, and at very wide scale. And yet, we have these small, or these areas of hope, and I think all of us, in whatever capacity we're doing, we should be just supporting and pushing and amplifying. And this is a real success, the creation of the Institute for Missing Persons. It was created by the UN General Assembly, but it is a success for the Syrian people who fought for this. And let us hope that, the head of this institution is being appointed as we speak right now, so we will hopefully hear more about the new person who will be leading this institution. But let us hope it is also the beginning of something different. And because we're talking about reclaiming narratives, and I'm going to stop very quickly, Bente, I do want to really pay tribute to Lokman and Monica Slim and Umam Documentation and Research for the decades of work that they have done in pushing for narratives in an incredibly hostile environment, and for which they paid a price. But the story of detention in Syria and of Lebanese people detained in Syria, no Lebanese in that environment was ready to hear or listen, and here I'm talking about the society and the political. And yet, Umam Documentation and Research did put out that narrative, did amplify that specific experience, and I thank them for it. Thank you.
Absolutely. I can just underline that. I'm very grateful also for that, and for having had the rare opportunities to be able to participate in these discussions with the former detainees that then came as part of the film that Monica and Lokman did of Tatmur. I think it would be absolutely relevant to see it, because even if it is talking about the past, I think we all know that it's not that distant. And here I would like to come back to you, Yassin. When we were talking about the difference between before and now, I think one of the main differences that you also mentioned was that before you would get into prison mainly because of being part of an organized opposition, a political party, and that after 2011 it just became overboarding, that it became very random, that it became much broader, and I think you referred to it as a Palmerization of what was happening in Syria, referring to the name that tourists know, the city of Tadmor by Palmyra. Could you explain what you mean by Palmerization?
So,
in the 80s,
كان سجن تدمر هو
in the 80s, Palmyra prison used to be like the example of the inhuman treatments, as Ilaf, I think, mentioned in this branch number 17. I used this to describe what was in Sidnaya happening in 2017 recently. And back then, in our time, in the 80s, Palmyra was the human massacre place. As I mentioned, 15,000 people or something like that were being killed. Palmerization of Syria, the Tatmara in Arabic, that was generalized after the revolution. And in the beginning, the prison is no longer the way it used to be, where we had prisons where political detainees would be put. People would not know what happened to their loved ones in Palmyra, but they would know that they would be in Palmyra prison or in the other, or Aleppo, or in Sidnaya, which were also being used and established in the second part of the 80s. The two biggest prisons in the country, Adra and Sidnaya, were established, set up in the end of the 80s when we had the first wave of political protest. When now we have a huge number of prisons in stadiums at the high point, or when the regime was cracking down on society. And when we speak about incarceration and arrests, that people still tend to think that there are security apparatuses, police, which are arresting people. No, that's not the case. In fact, the punitive character and instrument of the state has been destroyed. I mean, normally it's one of the competencies and one of the tasks of any state to prosecute and to punish people. And now we have different kinds of militias, we have young groups of people going wild, bands belonging to the regime, as Joumana also mentioned, where all kinds of methods are being used for not only arresting people inside Zainab and in torturing them. And in this sense, I was speaking about Palmerization of the country, so having turned all the country into a human slaughterhouse. And I linked these inmates in Sidnaya after the revolution. It has been estimated at 35,000 people. Slaughterhouse, I think it was in the beginning of 2017, Amnesty International, I think they are talking about 13,000 people who died under torture. It was between 13 to 15,000 people who died under torture. That was in the report that was issued 3 years ago. But Bente, please, if you allow me, I mean, that was what I was referring to, but please allow me to add upon that an important remark for those present here so they get an idea. due to the plurality and the diversity, the sheer number of detention places and prisons and institutions and bodies who imprison and there was something that the political character of using political detention in Syria was taken away, and different bodies, parties do incarcerate people, do arrest people. And then we could, before we could say, okay, people could get some information. But now it's being used to blackmail people. If they want information or if they want people to be released, then it can happen, but you need to pay for it, and you need to pay huge sums of money. And in many cases, there was also being deceit being imposed on the people. There was a study. There was also some, I think it was called the commerce of political detention in Syria. There was also a market, so to speak, so $80 million. Relatives paid $80 million just to get information. In very rare cases, people were released then. There was a story of someone who became very famous. What was the name of this young man? What was his name again? Omar al-Shughi was his name, where his family managed, after having paid enormous sums of money, to get him out of the prison. And then his weight was 35 kilos, based on the pictures that were being published. And now he's doing rather well, and he speaks English fluently now, and he's evolved. But in most cases, nevertheless, in rare cases, there was information being provided. In most cases, they didn't even get any information after having paid these huge sums of money about their son or their husband. And they had been killed, and then the relatives were being blackmailed. And that goes on until this very day. That is nothing that belongs to the past. And from among the things, Syria has been turned into a paradise for impunity. Nobody has been punished or being prosecuted for any maybe a police officer or anyone working in the security services, and that is also ongoing. Syria is a paradise for impunity, and that can be generalized on the general level of the Middle East, and I think Israel has benefited from that very much, from this impunity. So they're living in, say, a jungle area, a total area of chaos. There's no rules and no nothing in the Middle East. So we have the law of the jungle being applied. So Israel, why should it be an exception based on the precedents of the Syrian case? And why should Palestinians not go to Sinai, such as the Syrians went and took refuge in Turkey? So there has been this industry of what is possible and what is impossible. What used not to be possible in the past is now possible, feasible. The Palestinians struggled. Overall, over the years, there had been 22,000 people had been killed. Now, in Gaza only, we have more than 55,000 people. In Syria, we have 600,000 people, maybe, we mentioned. Unfortunately, the United Nations and in any other international organizations, I think since 2012, they are no longer counting and no longer can set up any statistics. What has been documented are, let's say, 600-something thousand. So let's say the Syrian Network for Human Rights, it's the most reliable network and source of information. And just a little remark to conclude. There is a model of the reign in the last 3-4 years, and then it's been generalized in the Middle East, where the power starves people, it incarcerates people, it tortures people. In Europe are people being convicted by, I don't want to be too broad, with Foucault discussed in the biopolitics, the society which disciplines people. The way power is being practiced in Syria, in Egypt, unfortunately as well generalized, and also in Palestine for the Palestinians, and by Palestinians as well, is the power which is damages and takes away the humanity of human beings. I think the European states, which Joumana just mentioned, they don't do it despite this being happening in Syria. No, they do that because it is happening in Syria. So they're guarding the borders of Europe. They're preventing people from crossing the borders in the Eastern Mediterranean. Van der Leyen went to see Sisi not long ago, and they decided to give huge amounts of money in aid. Also, they signed an agreement with Tunisia, and there are also detention centers in Turkey which are being financed by the EU. Detention center financed for refugees in Turkey. Most of them are Syrians, but there are also others, so that they stay detained there and they don't get into Europe. So this situation in Syria, in Europe, it's not yet manualized, let's say, it's not manual labor, but the model is being generalized.
Thank you, Yassin, for also highlighting this negative model. I think Monica was also hinting at that before when she said international law not being applied, and if we don't stick to the rules and if we don't implement the rules that are set, we will be losing everything. And I think also this is what we have been hearing from the very beginning of the Koblenz trial, from Syrian lawyers who were saying, well, you think this is about Syria? No, it is very much also about you. If you now are not accurate with upholding these values, what will it mean for you in the end? And I think maybe we are seeing many of the consequences in many places now, and I wished we could get back to more respect for international law and a stronger United Nations in terms of conflict resolution. And there, well, Joumana, I would like to ask you, because, I mean, it's also dire and we're going completely in the wrong direction, but you, as having been working on justice efforts and having many people who contribute to that, do you also think there is maybe a ray of hope where you say, well, it's not only impunity that spreads, but it's also a professionalization and a taking more seriously about justice efforts? And I mean, you, Lynn, have been highlighting it. Whatever we're seeing in terms of justice efforts, it's because of the strength of Syrians to really carry forward with it. And therefore, is there anything where you would say, Joumana, from your field of work, you see more engagement and you will be able to give us a positive spin from which we could then maybe take a positive role model?
أكيد بالتأكيد يعني أولاً
Certainly, for sure. First of all, working with the survivors, male and female, in the sense of the law, the victims, I directly work with them, and their courage, in fact, is astonishing at all times, and that's the basis for all these efforts. If there were not the testimonies being submitted, and they insisting on obtaining justice, that they're ready to stand in the trial, in the courtroom, before the judges to be interrogated by the police. It's not easy, and it opens up very painful memories of torture, of extreme violence, of practices which are very hard to be forgiven or even be omitted after years. And there were many occasions where unfortunate Syrians who were forced to take refuge and to leave, and with all these news and what's happening around us, they're not the appropriate conditions to heal or to become whole again, so to speak. So, and despite all this, they keep going, and that's really astonishing. And now we have lots of survivors, male and female, from violence who have moved. They did some kind of transition from being only a victim, so moving away from victimization, so they turned into those who hold the right, and they are the ones who decide about their own destiny. Even in international bodies in Geneva, in the Human Rights Council and elsewhere, they're no longer just allowing themselves to be considered victims. They have been doing away with this concept of victimization. So what has happened, these changes and these developments in the Syrian society itself, and particularly in the civil society, I would say, that has a really quantitative leap, and where most of those involved were survivors and victims themselves who provide services to their society. And via these service provision, since they are in the northwest in places, they have these institutions who can provide services to people there. And they have been replacing the state institution. And those are basically, most of them, in the sense of the law, they used to be victims, and this continuation that we'll experience. Let's give an example. Let's see. In the past week, I was at the second conference. I attended the second conference of the Syrian civil society to ask for justice, request justice for the use of chemical weapons. And there I met a huge number of survivors from these chemical attacks that have happened in Syria. And we discussed lots of them. I spoke to many of them. I saw activists, organizations, doctors who were first responders in these attacks, and who submitted lots of information, and those who were there participated in the discussions. And in fact, I have to say that the situation, when we want to see it in an overall picture, it's really astonishing how the regime, and particularly Russia and Iran, at its back, covering its back with all its might and power, they have been threatening these people, have been frightening them, and with everything they have in their hands as by competence in possibilities, and they also possibilities to deny and that they are implied in these chemical attacks. If you want, we can talk about this for hours on end, but I want to say there have so far been 5 international bodies of inquiry set up in these visual violations and these attacks. 5 international commissions or committees over all these years. These many reports have confirmed the responsibility of the regime. The strategy of the regime is to denial, to threaten and to cover up for, to threaten the witnesses, and to come up with false testimonies from false testifying witnesses. And with all this, after all these years, and people are still insisting and keep going, and they're looking for justice, and they're looking for those being brought to justice and accountability. And there is a group of, so the civil society have united, and the victims themselves have stood together, and also the people and the families of those who have been violated. And so now we have these 5 committees, being a working group also for international research, which encompasses 12 states in different geographical regions from Asia, Africa, Europe, America, it's the United States and France, to undertake an in-depth study of the options open to bring justice to those after all these having been killed, after the first conference that was held for the chemical attacks, and there was a clear suggestion, and it was very definite, which emerged as a result of this work over years and these conversations and consultations with the victims. And a suggestion was that a specific court of justice would be set up to try these international violations of law by using chemical weapons in Syria. But I think that is a very clear example of this perseverance of Syrians to try to get, where we try all together to try to gather these efforts, to join forces, to move forward in a certain direction, and maybe this mechanism to search for those who are still among the missing, we might be crowned with success, which is being considered successes so far on the judicial and court level that in other countries, and which has been achieved. But to be very succinct and precise regarding the victims themselves, for the millions of victims of all kinds of international crimes, which has been realized, is justice so far. In fact, these are all efforts undertaking, striving for the obtainance of justice. But I'd say justice is that they're being recognized, that we move into a just solution for them, and for their that they see a state they've been dreaming of being established, and where there's a recognition what has been done to them, then there's also traditional justice, also that a moral and also maybe a financial recompensation. So after all this what the Syrians have been exposed to, they might end up with something, with some kind of satisfaction and the conviction that something has been achieved. And I think without this real sense that at least partially an important minimum level of justice has been achieved, peace is impossible. Durable peace in the long run is impossible. And as long we are ongoing, as Yassin has mentioned, I hope it's not going to, that the things are not only worrying and of concern, it's more than that, actually. With that having it said, but where is it going to take us? Even if politicians build these detention centers elsewhere and all these oppression and injustice ongoing, this extremism, the rage, if we do not find a way out, that we get rid of it in channels where we have a justice in the justice system, and it's going to be getting rid of and explode into extremism. That can no longer be controlled in any way. Further on.
Thank you very much, Joumana, for giving us some hope and really underlining this point that it's not lost, even if we don't see results swiftly. And soon, I think the long breath that Syrians have is impressive as such. And I think it is also important because things might be lost. People might forget, witnesses might not be there any longer. So, Lynn, as far as I understand, for example, IIIM, the mechanism that is collecting documentation and data, that is also, it might be seen as toothless because it can't handle these cases on its own. But I have understood that courts, national courts, benefit a lot from not having to do all the work on their own. So maybe give us an idea. Is there a request for that, or is it a collection that is just ongoing?
Yes, I'll say as much as I know. I won't venture further. But the IIIM is another example of something unique and new that was created in the context of Syria that has no precedent in any other contexts. And it was created again because the road to the ICC was blocked by the vetoes at the Security Council. And the idea of this is, as they call it, it's called the Justice Accelerator. The mission of it is to actually do all of the first parts of what a classical trial would be, which is gathering the documentation and doing the legal analysis and building the case for prosecution specifically. So it's different from what the Commission of Inquiry, another UN human rights focused body, was created, also set up to document violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The IIIM was created in 2016, I believe, to build on these reports, this documentation by UN bodies, but by all of the different bodies. And you've given examples of how Syrian documentation groups have been extremely active from the very beginning of the days of the conflict and the protests. And so the IIIM, what it does is it gathers all of this information, but it analyzes it and it prepares files that are then ready to go to prosecution. But its usefulness is, as you were saying, Bente, its usefulness goes only as far as there are requests from national jurisdictions. So it's only when a country itself is saying, a national jurisdiction itself is saying, we would like to start a case. We think that we have one of the perpetrators on our soil, let's say, or we have a strong group of victims who are within our community and they're pushing for us to do something, or where there's a political agenda to do something, whatever the reason and the motivation, then the national jurisdiction would then go to the IIIM, and this is where the cooperation happens. Now, the IIIM, I don't know the numbers, but they have, I think, in the span of a few years, it took a bit of time. It's a very strange animal because it cannot really be visible on the work that it does. It cannot really be saying, we participated in this case. I believe one of the few cases that they've been open about was the case before the International Court of Justice by the Netherlands and Canada. But otherwise, it's strange in the sense that the only indicator that we have of its usefulness is the number of requests it gets from national jurisdictions. But this, we did see it jump in the past few years. The jump goes maybe to the fact that it's proven its usefulness, that it has convinced national jurisdictions that they can go this way. For many different reasons. But again, this is a body that was set up and created by the UN in an attempt to meet the demands of Syrian victims and survivors for justice. Donc it is a new model that was actually replicated in the Myanmar Rohingya context as well, after this one was created. So Syrians have a lot to be proud of in terms of inventing and creating new ways to deal with justice and truth, both.
afraid that I have been promising you too much, and I apologize for that. Time has been passing so quickly with all the relevant and pertinent contributions, and I'm very happy also that each of you chose to add some additional points, but that means that unfortunately we will not be going to have a round here in the audience, but I can just underline the invitation that was pronounced before. Let's go over to the Haut 2 and continue there over a glass of wine. Maybe it has been a very intense evening in all regards, so really I'm sorry for not giving you the chance here and abusing of my privilege as a moderator, but I was taken away by you all being so kind and so interesting, so please give a big applause to the amazing panel.